off at number 10, we have the story of Enoch. The full story of Enoch did not make it into the Bible. The book of Enoch was able to answer a couple of unanswered questions that were left by readers of the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible. The first question was about Enoch, who is Noah's great-grandfather. He was said to be such a bro with God that God took him up to heaven rather than allowing him to die. Now, the second big question that was unanswered, well, it has to do with the Nephilim. This mysterious race is said to be the offspring of God's sons and the daughters of men. Now, Enoch says that these sons of God were angels that fell in love with human females and taught them certain forbidden acts like practicing magic, and they gave birth to the Nephilim, who were cannibalistic giants. From there, we look at the Acts of Paul. In the Acts of Paul, Paul tells stories about his friendships with talking lions. Yeah, the Acts of Paul is a genre of apocryphal apostle acts explaining what Jesus' disciples and friends were up to after Jesus went back to heaven. Now, we currently only have fragments of different sections, and these sections include Paul's interactions with Thecla and the extended story of Paul's martyrdom by Emperor Nero. According to this, when Paul's head was taken off, milk was gushed out instead of blood. Number 8, this story has to do with God saving Thecla. Thecla is a young noblewoman in the story, and she overhears Paul's preaching about chastity, and then she devotes herself to follow his message. Her mother then sentences her to be burnt. Yikes! But God saves her by extinguishing the fire. Now, later, she's stripped of her clothing and thrown in front of beasts to be eaten, but again, she's protected by a fierce lioness. Thecla then decides to get baptized by diving into a tank of man-eating seals. Okay, but once again, God saves Thecla by zapping the seals with lightning. Thecla survived until the age of 90, and surprisingly, she ended up living a very happy life and died happy. Moving on to number 7, Ascension of Isaiah. It consists of Jewish and Christian texts from the 1st century BCE and the 3rd century CE. This tells the story of the martyrdom of the prophet Isaiah by King Manasseh and the tour of Isaiah in the 7 heavens. In the first section, Isaiah is accused of treason by a false prophet who was inspired by a demon by the name of Beliar. The Talmud states that Isaiah spoke the secret name of God, due to which he was swallowed by a tree, but luckily fringes on his clothing stuck out, which helped him get away. But Manasseh ended up capturing him and cut him lengthwise in 2 halves. Now, despite this painful experience, he continues to prophesy against the cruel king until the saw reaches his neck and mouth. Now, the second part explains where Isaiah was taken by various angels through different levels of heaven. Number 6 leads us to the Acts of Peter. In the canonical Acts of the Apostles, Simon Magus has a clash with St. Peter. He is a Samaritan wizard who tries to buy the Holy Ghost powers from the apostles using some money. Now, the apocryphal Acts of Peter expands and led Peter to a series of battles. During the battle, Peter teaches a dog how to talk and then sends him to Simon's house just to tell him that he is a garbage person. Peter publicly embarrasses Simon when he told everyone that he did not actually breathe life into a dead person, but he was actually playing with the body like a puppet to make it look like it was alive. Halfway in at number 5, did you guys know that Satan has a son? Well, in the Gospel of Bartholomew, the minor apostle Bartholomew is the only one who has the guts to ask God questions about the existence of nature. He asked God why he saw him disappear from the cross during the crucifixion. And God replies saying that, well, he went to hell to do a particular task. The book also claimed that Satan also has a son whose name is Salpsan. Now, number 4 is one of the most surprising, if not the most surprising story in this episode. Okay, some apocryphal texts are so bizarre that they're largely eradicated, right? Now, the Questions of Mary is a dialogue in which Jesus takes Mary Magdalene to a mountainside where he produces a woman from his side, similar to how Eve was formed from Adam. Now, this story then tells that Jesus starts to be intimate with this woman that he created and then eventually eats her. And Mary Magdalene is watching this, completely shocked, and she passes out, she loses her life, but Jesus ends up resurrecting her back to life and telling her that she just has little faith. She does not believe enough. The story at number 3 has to do with Mary and her purity in the infancy. Now, you might know the story of the Christmas and everything, but you probably don't know the 2nd century text known as the Infancy Gospel of James, and it tells a version of the story you probably never heard before. The beginning of the book explains the childhood of Mary, and this story tells how she remained a virgin all of her life. But then Joseph decided to marry her. Later, the story goes on to say that both of them were held in a cave, and now we all know the story of Mary who gave birth to Jesus while still being a virgin. But in this case, however, there was a midwife, and she does not believe at all in any virgin birth of any baby whatsoever. Yeah, quite different from the Christmas story that we're used to hearing. Story at number 2 is young Jesus' reign of terror. The canonical Gospels of Luke and Matthew describe Jesus' birth and then a brief episode at the Second Temple when he was 12 years old. But then the Bible, it jumps 30 years later when Jesus begins his ministry. So there's a lot of time that isn't accounted for. But in this story, we get to know what kind of life Jesus led growing up. And it said that young Jesus was very problematic and he did some terrible things. But he often later reversed his bad actions by using magical powers. And we end off this episode at number 1 having to do with the Apocalypse Peter. This is a 2nd century text, and the reason why it did not make it into the Bible was that it was found just completely distasteful by church fathers. This text tells about the vision that was granted to the Apostle Peter by a risen Jesus that enabled him to see visions of heaven and hell. And it tells how beautiful heaven is, but on the other hand, it talks about hell just being a terrible nightmare. A passage of the Apocalypse of Peter found in only one source, the Rainer fragment, which does not include the whole text though, but it says that dead saints, when they look down from heaven and see the torment of the sinners in hell, they could actually go and ask God for mercy, and then these tortured souls could actually be retroactively baptized and then saved and brought to heaven.
Let's get into it, starting with number 10, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. There's a whole lot of controversy surrounding this one. A German scholar purchased this gospel in Cairo, Egypt in the 19th century from an antique collector, and no one really knew of the existence of it until that time. Now, this gospel focuses on Jesus' closest followers. However, instead of focusing on the 12 disciples that most Christians know about, it places Mary Magdalene just at the center of the story. In the story, Mary is a figure who is a philosopher as well as a leader, and she plays a major role among the disciples. But sadly, only fragments of this book still exist to this day. Moving on to number 9, we look at the Gospel of Thomas. Now, this is a personal book that I even have in my own collection, and the Gospel of Thomas is probably the most well-known gospel not found in the Bible. The book was likely written in the 1st or 2nd century, but it was lost throughout most of history. It was then rediscovered by accident in 1945 in Egypt, and the Gospel of Thomas is different from the other Gospels. So instead of telling the story of Jesus, it's made up of sayings of Jesus. Most of these sayings, by the way, are sayings that are not found in the Bible, but many of the sayings are very similar or even word for word to the biblical texts. You'll find a lot of cryptic language and parables and phrases that sound contradictory in the Gospel of Thomas, and many scholars believe that the Gospel of Thomas was very popular for some time in early Christianity. Number 8 brings us to the infancy Gospel of Thomas, and this is often confused with the Gospel of Thomas itself. But scholars say that it's likely that these two books have nothing in common at all. They don't even have the same author. Either way, as time went on, Christians were very curious about the life of Jesus and wanted to know more about him. Now, this gospel, it attempts to fill in the gaps of Jesus' life that are not found in the 4 Gospels of the Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. This gospel focuses a lot on Jesus' childhood years, and most of this book, by the way, surprisingly, it remains intact and you can still read it today. Number 7 leads us to the Gospel of the Savior. Now, this was one of the most recently discovered Gospels. Just as recent as the year 1997, it was discovered when an American scholar went through the archives of a Berlin museum, and among some ancient manuscripts, boom, there he found fragments of this gospel. This book tells the story of Jesus, except the details are a bit different. Like, Jesus does many of the same things, except at different times and places. For instance, the phrase when he says, "Remove this cup from me," when he's praying to God, that speech is there, but it actually takes place in a dream and not in the Garden of Gethsemane. Number 6 leads us to the Gospel of Truth. Now, the Gospel of Truth was likely written in the 2nd century, possibly by an ancient Christian philosopher who went by the name of Valentinus. And the name of the book suggests, though, that it was really to correct some ideas that were propagated in the other Gospels. This book, however, does not contain the life of Jesus or his words and actions. It's written more like a sermon or theological writings. This Gospel was rejected to be included in the Bible because it was criticized by most ancient Christian writers for its differences. The Gospel of Philip comes in the number 5 spot. The Gospel of Philip differs in its style as well as its content than other Gospels. Most Gospels focus on the narrative of Jesus' life, but this one is more like a sermon, and many of the concepts practiced in Christianity are mentioned, but in this case, they're referred to more as parables and metaphors rather than actual rituals and practices. Its philosophy is very different from other Christian Gospels, and parts of it don't even sound like Christianity at all. Rather, it sounds like they're taken from other religions. And most of this text, surprisingly, also still exists to this day. Now, next up, number 4, the Gospel of the Nazarenes. If you don't know, the Nazarenes were another early sect of Christianity, and the Nazarenes really kept Jewish customs and laws, and this gospel emphasized the Jewishness of Jesus, and also it was written in Aramaic, the language that Jesus spoke. But only very small sections of this gospel still remain to this day. Similarly, next up, we look at the Gospel of the Ebionites. They were also a sect, and they lasted from the 2nd to the 4th centuries. They maintained many of the Jewish customs and traditions, even after many other Christians abandoned those traditions. They also disagreed a lot when it came to fundamental aspects of wider Christian philosophy, especially when it comes to the Trinity. They rejected that concept completely. They argued that instead Jesus was not God, but he was simply just a human. But of course, this didn't fall in line with popular Christianity at the time. The Gospel of the Ebionites was rejected when the Gospel was compiled, and most of the text was lost, but sections still remain. And now that leads us to number 2, the Gospel of Peter. Now, this gospel claims to have been written by the disciple Peter, but many scholars say that that wasn't the case at all. It's believed to have been written 100 years after the time of Peter. Either way, it also uses all 4 biblical gospels as its sources, and the text was discovered in an Egyptian tomb in the 19th century. Many of the teachings in this gospel were viewed as heretical. For instance, it claims that Jesus didn't suffer on the cross, as well as other doctrines just contradicted what Christians believed. It does also include some interesting details though, like for example, when Jesus ascended ascended to heaven, this book says that two giant angels who stand taller than the sky supported him as he ascended. That there isn't found in other biblical gospels. Now we end off with number 1, the Gospel of Judas. This text is believed to have been written in the 4th century and was found in the 20th century. In the New Testament Gospels of the Bible, Judas is a disciple who betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. So it's kind of odd that there would be a gospel authored by Judas or according to his perspective. Either way, when this gospel was first revealed, the translation depicted Jesus in a negative light, and Judas is viewed as the good guy in the story. The text suggests that it was all part of Jesus' plan to be betrayed in the first place, and Judas was actually a hero because he fulfilled what Jesus wanted to do. Many of the passages from the book challenge fundamental Christian teachings, and it is not believed that Judas himself wrote it though, and portions of the text can still be read today, but a lot of it has been lost over time.
At number 10, we have the Epistle of Barnabas. This epistle was written after the destruction of the Jewish temple, but it was also written before the year 132. It was often attributed to Barnabas, the companion of Paul, but scholars say that it could actually be a different Barnabas that wrote this one. This book explores Christianity's relationship with Judaism, which was a big topic of debate at that time. And it rejects completely the value of the previous teachings in Judaism, and it also rejects all ceremonial aspects of Judaism. This epistle of Barnabas makes arguments from the Torah to support Christianity as the true religion, and the epistle of Barnabas quotes a lot of the Old Testament, including the book of Enoch, which is actually not even included in the Old Testament of the Bible. But since we're dealing with just books not in the New Testament, I'll save the book of Enoch for another video. Moving on now to number 9, we have the Apocalypse of Peter. The last book of the Bible, and perhaps the book that's most known even when it comes to non-biblical circles, well, it's a book of the apocalypse or Revelation. Some of you might know it as that. This book describes visions of the end times, as well as it describes what heaven is going to be like and things like that. However, this is not the only apocalypse book that was read by early Christians. Introducing the Apocalypse of Peter. This book is written in the form of a conversation between Jesus and his disciples, and it describes what happens in hell, and it also describes what happens in heaven. Now, this book is very descriptive, very detailed. It dives into like the type of punishments that people are going to receive for doing various different evil deeds if they're sent to hell. So for example, like those who blaspheme against God, they're hung by their tongues. And men and women who committed adultery, well, they're hung by their hair and their feet over a boiling substance, among many other descriptive things. Now, those people who are granted heaven, well, they are beautiful, they have great, amazing skin, they smell good, they get to live forever and sing beautiful songs. Number 8 brings us the infancy gospel of James. So there was many other gospels other than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that were written, and some specifically share details of the infancy of Jesus. And one of these infancy gospels is the Gospel of James. This focuses a lot on the importance of Mary, and it describes even her birth as well as her life growing up, and it sheds a lot of light on the early years of her son, Jesus. The gospel does claim that Mary was a perpetual virgin, and it details Jesus' early life in Egypt, as well as it looks at the similarities and the differences between Jesus and John the Baptist. The book also describes the nativity scene as something that happened in a cave. The next book is Shepherd of Hermas. This book had a lot of influence on early Christianity. And now the shepherd was referenced by many early Christian fathers, for example, like Tertullian, Irenaeus, as well as Clement of Alexandria, and also Origen. It was used as scripture by some early churches, as well as it was rejected by others. And one quote from Origen says that, well, it's considered a scripture, but Tertullian and Clement of Alexandria said that is completely heretical. The Shepherd of Hermas is very symbolic and is written mostly in the first person, describing the visions of Hermas, who was a former slave. It also includes 12 commandments as well as 10 parables, mostly dealing with things like Christian ethics. From there, we move on to 1 Clement. 1 Clement is one of 2 letters to the church in Corinth attributed to Pope Clement of Rome. Now, it was highly regarded, and it's one of the earliest written books that eventually failed to make it into the New Testament, being dated to be around 95 AD. The book itself is focused on a dispute in the church at Corinth about the removal of several church leaders, and Pope Clement had objected to this removal, so he wrote to them. Halfway in at number 5, we have the Gospel of Thomas. This is probably the most famous gospel that was not included in the New Testament. The Gospel of Thomas is not a book that was passed down through the ages, but it was actually rediscovered as part of the Nag Hammadi Library in the year 1945. And when it comes to the Gospel of Thomas, there's actually no real evidence that it was widely accepted by early Christians. People don't even know if it was highly read. But the Gospel of Thomas is completely different from the current 4 Gospels that are in the New Testament. It's simply a collection of sayings that are attributed to Jesus. A lot of them are wise sayings, parables, very cryptic sayings. The Gospel of Thomas has been one of the most widely studied books not included in the New Testament because of its content, like I just mentioned. All it does is focus on Jesus' teachings and how they lead to salvation once properly understood. It's a very fascinating book. I do have a copy myself, and yeah, it's an interesting read. Number 4 brings us to the lost epistles to the Corinthians. 1st and 2nd Corinthians are major epistles of Paul that are included in the New Testament of the Bible, and these letters are the basis of a lot of Christian ethics. But there were other letters between Paul and the Church of Corinth that weren't included. One of those letters actually was apparently written before 1 Corinthians, and it was actually referenced by Paul in 1 Corinthians 5 verse 9, where he says, "I wrote to you in my previous letter not to associate with sexually immoral people." Now, we have no evidence of this letter outside of this reference, but it makes you wonder what else Paul wrote. Number 3 brings us the 3rd letter to the Corinthians. This is another letter from Paul. This letter has survived, and it was included in some early lists as sacred, but by the 4th century though, it wasn't considered valid at all, so it was not included in the Bible. Unlike the 1st and 2nd epistles of Corinthians in the New Testament, this one is considered by many to be written by someone other than Paul. Perhaps one of Paul's students, or just somebody completely different. This letter deals with correcting the interpretation of the first 2 epistles. Number 2 is Q. Yeah, Q, that's it. Q is actually a supposed document. It's a hypothetical gospel that would contain the similarities between the 3 gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptic gospels. And it was to bridge the differences as well. Its existence was first proposed in 1900 by scholars trying to understand the similarities between the 3 books, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. All 3 Gospels share stories and phrases, and some of them even have direct quotes from each other, like literally word for word. Mark has the most in common with both Matthew and Luke, but there are parts of Matthew and Luke that are not in Mark, and of course each book contains parts that are not in any other book. And the tricky thing though is that back then there was no strict source referencing system when it came to writing, so the Q hypothesis claims that there could have been another gospel that included all, or at least the parts missing from Mark, of the similar content used in the 3 mentioned gospels. Now, where this hypothesis completely falls apart though is that we don't even have a copy or partial or any fragment of this document at all. Also, no books reference to it at all. It's just like a mysterious gospel. So at this point, it could have existed and it's lost forever, or it just hasn't been rediscovered yet, or it's just completely and totally made up. We end this episode off at number 1. We have the Didache. The Didache, which means the Lord's teachings of the 12 apostles, is a step-by-step instruction for Christian life. The first part of the Didache is on how Christians should apply God's commandments, okay? Then the second part is about the religious rituals like baptism and the Eucharist, as well as fasting. And then the third section is about how the church should be structured. The Didache was almost included in the New Testament, but it was ultimately rejected. And the big question, though, is how would a book like this have influenced Christianity as we know it today if it was included? Having a step-by-step guideline for major religious obligations may have prevented the formation of the plethora of Christian branches that exist today.